Thank you, Matt, for the introduction, and thank you to everyone here today. Thank you to University of Texas for inviting me to be a part of the lecture series. It's an exciting list. That was, I think, the first lecture you had this semester is a friend of mine, Lucy Begg, who we met at the Rural Studio. So I was super happy to see your kind of total lineup. I had originally titled the lecture House Gables because I wanted to introduce Mall's very first built project, meaning not a gallery installation or a temporary work, but a real piece of architecture. But such a short title for a project that's taken so long to complete, or conceptualize, develop, and build, House Gables no longer seemed fitting. So instead, I proposed the following title. So this is the title. I won't read it out loud. It's annoying. It barely fits on the slide, and it's going to pose problems for your archival process here at the school. But I insist it has to be this full title. And I'm going to check back in. So tonight's talk, I will describe the conceptual and intellectual project around questions of ordinary architecture, spanning 4 years of my work, which initially began as a research project studying roof typologies in Atlanta, Georgia. This research then led to a series of exhibitions, models, drawings, and writings, all in an effort to kind of unpack a capital P project for my practice. And then it ends in a completion of a single family house also in Atlanta that Matt mentioned. So I will attempt to stitch together high concept with things like wall assemblies and mix up a discourse around architecture's representation with the reality of conditions found on site. And lastly, I'll offer up a suggestion on how we might shift into a new spatial paradigm, something I'm calling the roof plan. MAL is the name of my practice. It stands for Mass Architectural Loopty Loops. The acronym is a 20th century Americanism. It's in wide circulation. Americans love their shorthand. And this is what MAL looks like in a sea of known acronyms outside of our discipline, ranging from governmental agencies and digital technology to best social media practices, OMG. Here is MAL sitting amongst other architectural practices who also use acronyms, firms like Foster & Partners and David Chipperfield Architects, who were my former employers. And MAL uses short form as a way of allowing the long form name to change month to month, or as our architectural interests shift for each project. So MAL is interested in an intellectual project, not a formal project, which is why a lot of our architecture tends to look differently from project to project, meaning there's no formulaic formal process. So MAL can also mean miniature angles and little lines, or it could mean maximum arches with limited liability, and we can add the C on the end if we're feeling overly professional. But before I introduce this body of work around ordinary architecture, I wanted to situate the project amongst several other projects. Much of the ethos at MAL, as Matt said, places an emphasis on misbehaving in architecture, and hopefully this becomes apparent in the next few slides. The following projects represent a cross-section of failed competitions, gallery installations, publications, and temporary architectural experiments in the public realm. They are what we call MAL's 10 best practices in a kind of top 10, although I think there's 11. Number 1, flood a gallery on Hollywood Boulevard. So this was a project where I purchased one large sheet of rubber and filled a gallery space associated with Woodbury University on Hollywood Boulevard. So opening night, we asked visitors to put on these plastic booties to protect their shoes. Everything was going fine until we kind of sprung a leak and we needed to pump and drain all the water back out onto Hollywood Boulevard. No one seemed to matter nor care. Number 2, fly drones and synchronization, scanning Mies van der Rohe's House Longa and House Esther's. So this is started as a research project where I proposed flying 4 drones in synchronization. 2 drones you see here are scanning Mies's bricks. So they're starting at the top and scanning the bricks, coursing by coursing down the facade. Then there's also 2 other drones filming the synchronized drones, recording the building, which is creating a 3-dimensional mesh. And I'm interested in Mies's projects. These are 2 houses. They're in Krefeld, Germany. They're not twins. They're kind of doubles. They sit right beside each other. Mies had 2 separate clients and got to test out this idea about brick and the picture window. And so the large picture windows are holding these 2 structures together in their similarities. But Mies is also looking at the drawings and the plans of the house. There's a lot of steel inside, so I'm arguing that Mies's bricks are actually fake. You know, obviously they're not load-bearing, but we can also just think about them as a material that can be exchanged for something else. So back in the studio, I start thinking about how might this turn into a representational project, and thinking about early renderings in architecture and how there was a lot of kind of using bitmaps and they weren't tileable and we could see seams and like you knew it was an early rendering because of the seam was kind of repeating and not worked out. So back in the studio I had what I was calling a bad mesh, which was a point cloud that was really heavy, and it was bad in that it's not exact, it's not precise. I thought I would be able to see all the kind of grains of the brick. The second thing I'm bringing to the table is a bad bitmap. And so in this case, I'm just showing a picture of H.H. Richardson's like rusticated block. And then the third ingredient is a bad bump map. So in this case, using a split fieldstone. And these 3 things I start putting together and changing out the variables. So on the far left is like brick, but now it's no longer brick. It has pink, millennial pink grout, like oversized salmon CMU block. These are the materials that were then being exchanged for one another. Yeah, like rendering OSB board as a split fieldstone bump map. And then these are the kind of effects that we were getting. So it's purely a rendering exercise, but then also potentially leading us into a new materiality. So can the bump map be misaligned to the original bricks? And is that pink grout line now a graphic baked into potentially a ceramic tile? We're no longer dealing with bricks, but like what is the material? So these are some of the effects, like vinyl siding that's usually laid horizontally is now at an angle, and then we're also looking at like scalloped shingles. Number 3, make public space that is strange. So this is a project called Another Axon. It was a temporary installation in downtown Boston on the Rose Kennedy Greenway. And the whole thing is about constructing a view from a nearby parking garage from the top level. And so from this view, one kind of sees the kind of perfect axonometric view. When working in the public realm, the project then becomes like photographed in particular ways, and then you can like find all of these different versions and views of that constructed perfect axon that I was looking for. This project is totally using everyday materials, vinyl siding's been like hung in incongruent directions. The white objects that you see are a series of minimal art sculptures from like Judd and others, and downloaded off of Google SketchUp. And this is the sunset view. This is the backside view. There's the top of that parking garage where the view is constructed. And this is the view that people are sitting in their car on the off-ramp of the I-93 coming into downtown Boston. So we asked the question, can a drawing be architecture? And so we're drawing through hatches of the architect's palette, landscape hatches, and we're mapping those onto the material. This is a plan view of the project. It looks like an axonometric view, but it's the perspective. And this is an axonometric drawing. Number 4, propose a perfume strategy for a public park in Canada. So this is one of those failed competition entries. The next couple of projects are a series of public art proposals in collaboration with my former partner, Christian Stainer. And we were really trying to kick off practice and saw that there was a number of public art callings throughout the United States. And so our mission was to kind of sneak in architectural ideas into this kind of juried system. And so in this case, we designed 11 like perfume sculptures or structures that inside would emit scent for a park in Canada. We couldn't go visit we couldn't pitch this proposal, so we just send our ideas like in this box. We gave the jury instructions to like wear white gloves and then each spray these like scent perfume vials to actually see what the smells were like. That was that one we didn't win. Actually, my husband was shortlisted as well, and his team won the project. So it was a very difficult time in our household. There's a lot of tears, and we ultimately decided don't compete against each other. So that's just a future note for future relationships. Number 5, install an olfactory project in the mechanical room of the Istanbul Modern Museum. So when you have good ideas, you have to then like repackage them and somehow get them built or get them realized. Like you can't wait to like always win the competition. So we were asked to exhibit work inside of the Istanbul Design Biennial. This was like 6 years ago. And we were given like a 10-foot, 12-foot spot on a wall. And we were asked to show all of our research and drawings around olfaction, where we'd done a series of drawings around prestigious landscapes, ranging from Parc de la Villette to Martha Schwartz's Bagel Garden. But what we did was we worked with Christophe Laudermille, a French perfumer, and we hacked into the HVAC system of the Istanbul Modern. So this is us on opening night. And Christophe has designed 2 scents that were pumping on timers throughout the HVAC. So as you approach the biennial over the course of 2 or 3 months, you would have these scents playing on timers. Number 6, rent a green screen to convince clients of micro enterprise projects in North Miami. So at the time we were in Los Angeles and we were, it's really cheap to rent a green screen, and it's like $50 an hour or something. And so we tried to create a film or short film. And we actually were awarded the commission on this one. They were wanting a sculpture in a cul-de-sac for a neighborhood, and we instead proposed 11 micro enterprise additions to the housing stock of the neighborhood to kind of upstart businesses and home businesses. So these are a few of the plans. There's a recording studio, a hair salon, a bicycle repair. So these are businesses that are attached on. We're also helping the community kind of rewrite the zoning code, and then the kind of architecture creeps into domesticity. Number 7, exhibit work in U-Hauls and parking lots outside of major art institutions. So this was a show which was curated by 4 people, Danielle Rago, Courtney Kaufman, Jonathan Louie, and James Michael Tate. And they specifically asked a group of architects of Los Angeles to exhibit our work in U-Hauls, timed with, this is in the Geffen Contemporary parking lot. And it was timed with a show at MoCA Geffen, which was called New Sculpturism. So inside the museum or the institution was Frank Gehry and Neil Denari and all of the like established architects. And there was this young group of architects kind of trying to make noise outside. Number 8, throw a picnic for architecture. So this, I think, is the image that you've used for your poster. This is a project, asking the question, how can we deny extrusion in architecture, and how can we think about architecture being a series of stacks? And we should study the way sandwiches are constructed, or kind of take on a close reading of the best sandwiches. As we all know, that this is a thing that exists in popular culture and people get into many fights about. So the tall one is a Dagwood. There's like, this is a grilled cheese sandwich. When you're throwing architecture picnic, you should bring plates and like arrange them and photograph them in this way. This was made, the photograph was made with a food photographer, Adam Detour, in Boston. BLTs. But all of this is in an effort to, again, write and think and exhibit ideas about architecture, and then try to develop it into a real building. So this past summer, I was looking at the viability of taking on one of these sandwiches as a speculative office building in downtown Atlanta. And so my team went out and made another picnic in the park in Cambridge somewhere. Number 9, create a discourse around architecture of the Dirty South via guidebook. This is a project I did with graduate students at Georgia Tech, where I was setting up a series of questions around East Coast, West Coast architects, obviously making an analogy to the rap industry. And as we all know, in the Dirty South, Goody Mob and Outkast kind of outsold the record numbers between the East and West Coast rappers in the mid-90s, and it redirected attention from the two coasts to the South. And so I thought this is a way to kind of rethink architecture of the South. So we weren't really interested in who the architects are, but really like what patterns have emerged and formed in the city of Atlanta. So half of the guidebook is like real tours, but inside the pages kind of fold out and you can see speculative proposals from the students. So this student in particular looked at the work of John Portman and then proposed a architecture full of atria, as you can see here. So there's half of the guidebook is a series of discussions with people like Denise Scott Brown, Max Goggin and Merrill Elam, a series of architects, but also this particular one is an interview with from Big Gip, Cujo, and Timo from Goody Mob. And so I just encourage you all to get a copy. It's on Amazon, to know why Goody Mob said the Olympics were brought to Atlanta in 1996. But you have to get the book to know that answer. Okay, just 2 more, and then I'll go into the house. Number 10, question how architectural models are displayed. So as a faculty member at the GSD, I was asked to be the faculty editor of basically our school yearbook. It's called Platform. And the dean really asked the faculty to take an intellectual position about the work of the school. And so my thinking was to combine 2 things. One, this notion of a still life, which is an extremely robust media to arrange and compose like disparate objects or disparate forms and projects. And then the second thing that I'm bringing is this idea about color. So I was really looking at the work of Barbara Kasten, who used colored gel and light to work on her photographs. And so there would be like a sea of brown chipboard, brown cardboard, white 3D prints, white card models. There was like 500 of them. And so this was actually like a projective thing back to the students. Hey, what if we use color in our architectural representations? The book then got picked up by Tongji University Press and has now been printed in Mandarin. Number 11. throw a pool party in LA, but with no water this time. So completely opposite than the first project. This is a opening night for a magazine launch of a magazine called Art Papers. It's a special edition on architecture and design, and Art Papers is a contemporary art magazine out of Atlanta that's been kind of going and in circulation since the 70s. And I was asked to be the guest editor with kind of full editorial range, except that the main editor, Victoria Camblin, said that the issue had to be about Los Angeles. So I then commissioned 35 contributors, writers, architects, theorists, and critics to look at how the swimming pool and other watery spaces affect LA's architecture and design culture. I asked the graphic designer April Greiman to design the magazine. She started to change the format like completely than what Art Papers was used to. This is the cover where Laurel Broughton, an architect in LA, had drawn all these funny drawings around the pool. She thought they were going to be kind of scattered throughout, and then we said, no, it's actually going to be the cover. These are some of the spreads of the various contributors. So I think these projects kind of explain the architectural interest. It's work that usually begins with a question rather than a sketch. It relates directly to popular culture, it is graphic, and it relies on art practice as inspiration. For the second half, I'd like to describe house gables, but placing emphasis on 3 models. So I'll try to talk about this work through these 3 models, one being the massing model, 2 being the dollhouse model, and the 3rd being a one-to-one model. So the first one up is this idea of a massing model. Ordinary architecture is often overlooked. It's a throwaway. The stuff that is immediately accessible but usually tossed aside. And I ask questions, what is the ordinary and why is the ordinary relevant now? Or how might we flip the ordinary into a representational project? The ordinary is what I've termed the contractor stockpile. So all things pertaining to the roof. And the lingo goes like this: eaves, ridges, rakes, valleys, soffits, gables, hips, and dormers. One of the literary references for the contractor stockpile is probably Hawthorne's House of Seven Gables and the hashtag domestic hats. And if we consider the contractor as a geometrist for a moment, then it's possible to think about these piles of 2x6s in wood frame construction as a project of planar inclination. And I might go as far as to say that these geometries are the American version of the contemporary cathedral, because it's a close reading also about the roof. In the contractor stockpile, there's endless variations of pitches, but they usually are like slopes with like 3 to 12, 7 to 12, or 9 to 12. This is a straightforward catalog of basic roof types. And they're so commonplace that we've forgotten their names, or that we've overlooked the spatial possibilities that might take place when we flip our thinking about how they might affect the project of interiority. So current modes of construction from the contractor camp promote building vented roofs, yet in the unvented roof, it allows for visual connection to what is otherwise might be deemed as attic geometry. So what happens in the attic stays in the attic on the example on the left. And so we never see the kind of underbelly of the roof in like most basic housing. So in the next 8 slides, I want to demonstrate even further what I mean by close reading and offer a formal analysis of these very banal forms. So now I'm less interested in the 2x6s and the tectonic of the ordinary, but really reading these forms as exciting massing models or volumes. And I've cropped them so you're just kind of looking at the roof, you're not getting distracted by the other things of house. So in figure 1, demonstrates how a gable roof is covered by a hip roof. Figure 2, two intersected gables with offset and misaligned shed roofs. Figure 3, chamfered triple hips with asymmetrically extruded gables. So I'm about to call on somebody from the audience to give it a try, so be ready. In figure 4, there's actually a lot going on here, so if you try to figure out what's going on, it's pretty complicated. We have asymmetrically triple gables, 1, 2, 3, with a shed roof lodged in between. And all of these roof forms are also intersected with 2 perpendicular and stacked gables. But let's not forget about that single dormer over there. Or is that 2 dormers instead of 1? Did I miscount the first roof as a gable instead of a second dormer? And so you understand how it gets pretty complicated when you try to do the analysis on it. Figure 5, stacked, stretched, and clipped gables, also known as the gable stack. Piggybacked hip dormer, nested on 2 bullioned gables. Okay, this is my favorite one, front-facing gable with a camel-backed hip plus a rotated gable with a mini gable bump in the back. And so the research began by taking a fairly random sample of 50 houses in Atlanta. And so I cut through 8 different neighborhoods, and what we noticed is a few tendencies about the collection. Firstly, that roof geometries in more affluent neighborhoods, such as Virginia Highlands, were more convoluted, they're more elaborate and complex, while in the lower socioeconomic neighborhoods, such as Old Fourth Ward, there appeared to be more humble roof lines. But rendered in all white, the ordinary construction method is less present, and abstraction points towards another potential construction method. So Object 21 is located in Buckhead, and so this is one of the most expensive neighborhoods in the city. And you can see it's a mashup of 8 different roof types, and this is all necessary to cover a 6,000 square foot villa. At the extreme opposite end, in object number 41, it represents a singular hip roof covering a simple shotgun house in the neighborhood of Cabbagetown. And so as the recipient of the Young Architects Forum's Emerging Voices Award, we were asked to make a solo exhibition in a 10,000 square foot gallery space in Atlanta. And it consisted of 16 large massing models measuring 3 foot by 5 foot by 3 foot in height. And so I got a call, "You've won this award." And I was like, "Well, I didn't apply. What does it mean?" They're like, "Well, you have to do a show of your work." And I was like, "Well, I don't really have any work." So this award really pushed me to make big work. And maybe this is where the conceit of where the massing model came in. Because I knew I had to fill a kind of space of this size. And I knew I wasn't going to make another pond and flood the floor. So this is what we call the mega massing model. It's 12 feet by 20 foot by 6 feet in height. And so we're asking questions about the massing model and its potentiality for architecture. And so these are some of the massing models. So we're absorbing lessons learned, in that study. But things start to get reorganized, misaligned. So what happens when an A-frame no longer produces a snug fit to the adjoining gable, or when a hip roof no longer sits symmetrically as the primary volume? And then when we see all 16 massing models together, an excessive amount of formal qualities emerge. The representation took on the axonometric drawing, but these 2 axons are doing very different things. On the right, the kind of razzle-dazzle surface is coating the exterior of the roof, whereas the one on the left is a drawing of all the wires for running it through our wire cutter. So this body of work rethinks the role of the massing model in architectural representation. Massing models, as we all know, are usually small in size. They're the result of an iterative design process by the architect. They represent the schema, the diagram, or proto-architecture. They lack detail, and they're often made out of a singular material. Massing models distinguish differences in a volumetric study. Should we make it slightly thinner, no, a little longer, or better yet, let's make it fatter? Domestic Hats delights in these tendencies to engage multiples, but rejects the constraint of smallness. So for these purposes, the models are scaled up to an awkward size without the luxury of more detail or information. They're not easily transportable, and they didn't fit in our frame of our foam cutter. So they're difficult to work on. Nor do they sit comfortably on a client's conference room table. Intentionally inflated, they merely represent themselves and no longer a representational stand-in for something else. So after the show, we took the domestic cats back out into the original context, like literally using them as yard art in front of the original forms, roof forms that were sampled. And it's here that they start to show off novel forms of the ordinary when they're positioned alongside those original gables, hips, and dormers. And just as the plywood has been sheathed over the wood framing in the contractor's stockpile, it's operating at its best. Here, Domestic Hats is found sitting on the front porch, meeting its match in the real example of the overscaled massing model. So if the larger conceptual project can be loosely thought of as working on 3 models, and the first model is definitely concerned with representation. The second model, what we call the dollhouse model, is also concerned with representation, but presents an alternative motives. So number 1, materials, and number 2, the spatial possibility for a new paradigm. So the dollhouse model is 1 to 12, rejecting the free plan and the ROM plan paradigms of the past. House Gables and the dollhouse model invents what we are calling the roof plan. This is no longer a top-down orthographic drawing seen in a set of permit drawings, but a potential paradigm or ideology that can reorganize the way we think about space and the plan logic. So in the first plan, on first glance, it seems not to be concerned with the roof, but there are actually 2 spaces that allow a kind of relationship to the underbelly of the house. And I don't think you can see my cursor. Okay, but it's just over the stairs, and then it's that kind of middle room. The second floor plan, which is obviously consumed by the roof, the plan starts to make kind of roof rooms and start to dominate the kind of plan logic. So in section, you can see that some of the roof rooms are actually hung from the roof forms themselves. And then the next set of images, we're working through scale of the dollhouse model and the digital model, and through drawings, trying to spatialize how the roof plan might make inflections on interior organization. So following the kind of spatial logic of the roof plan, the interior materials are literally mapped onto the room, but without an overall logic. It's done by a kind of one room-by-room basis. And so in the dollhouse model, this house actually has been built out of cross-laminated timber panels, which are like 87, but the point of making the dollhouse model is not to try to figure out how all those panels fit together, but to really make a dollhouse model. So there's one seam, and the birch veneer plywood like swings open like a dollhouse to reveal the section. At 1 to 12 scale, these materials are graphic, they represent pop, and are not what they seem. Sited in the American South, the project undertakes an old tradition of faux finishing. So for Southerners, there's a history of not being able to afford precious materials with a subsequent desire of faking it. Seen here is the Southern Institute of Faux Finishing. This is a real place. It's in Brandon, Mississippi. I've never been. I'm probably never going to go. But on the right is an example of a porcelain bathtub that's been decked out as faux marble. So there were ambitions here for the bathtub to be marble, and it appears just as like a paint finish. So when thinking about grafting on exterior faux finishes or interior faux finishes, this is a set of drawings that were for the building permit, which shows potentially having 55 feet length drawing of brick onto a facade. And I was really looking at the work of Mary Corse and her white light paintings from the late 60s, where she was using the kind of glass beads that are in our reflective markers on roadways. And so she's actually trying to use this material as paint. And so back at the GSD, we're trying to make a kind of faux brick jig. The pile of stuff, those are those glass beads. And we also looked at making like a custom roller, which would have like wood grain that could be rolled out 55 feet long. This was the kind of mock-ups that we made. This is an exhibit in the Yve YANG gallery in Boston. And so it's hard to photograph, but when light hits it, or if from a certain view you can see reflectivity in the mock-ups. And so this is now installed on house gables. On the left is kind of at dusk, at sunset, and on the right is like a image of the facade with a flash. And so when I described the research and the faux brick process of the fake brick stamp to subcontractors in Atlanta, they responded with, oh, we've already done Arby's like that. And I was a little disheartened that white fake bricks were already a thing in Atlanta or in the South, but I proceeded forward anyways. They didn't have the glitter, I think. So it ended up being a commercial product, which is like literally a sticker. And here they are installing the stickers for the whole facade. But the thing is, in the last kind of coat, I've asked them to throw in glass beads as kind of a dash finish. And that was the kind of faux glitter. And this is where the 1,700 square feet of glitter stucco comes in. So it was nice to see the stickers and like the process of them moving along the wall. On the interior, there was an idea about using wainscoting and faux finishes on the interior to kind of code the rooms that were being projected from the roof. And so there's an attempt, this is the material palette, and so we're working with what I call like faux terrazzo. So it's not terrazzo made poured in place as you would in Spain or Greece and making like a solid floor. This is like a thin veneer tile that's purchased and shipped over. There's a series of vinyls that are trying to look like marble or abstractions of marble. So like that blue rubber confetti material, or in the case of the pink, this is like a cartoonish drawing of marble. And on the very right, this is an image of OSB board. This is not OSB board, but it's then been baked into a ceramic tile. So when in these two rooms that I've clipped out here, there would be black terrazzo beside OSB, beside a gray terrazzo, or there would be like three versions of marble trying to like talk to each other and plan. And this is some of the finishes like installed a couple of months ago on site. So corners of showers, top views of plans. But before moving on to introducing the third model, I wanted to note a few things about the house in relationship to site, because that's what architects should do. This is the site plan. There's 4 kind of narrow urban lots here, each of which are like 24 feet wide. And so the property came with a variance. So instead of a 6-foot side yard setback, it's a 3-foot side setback. And so the next house over would essentially be 6 feet away. And so the total width construction of the house is 18 feet, which is about the width of a single wide trailer. And then just behind the lot is a warehouse, and on the other side of that is something called the Beltline. And so the Beltline is a new and exciting project in Atlanta, which was a former Rust Belt that links 45 in-town neighborhoods together. With a pedestrian path, and it's kind of driving, obviously, development in the city. So the New York Times, thanks a lot, New York Times, calls it a glorified sidewalk, but actually it is, you know, kind of like the High Line for Atlanta. And so on the right, these are just like some of the examples of how people are using it. And so when starting to think about how to translate the domestic hats work into a real larger 1-to-1 scale massing model, I threw out all the various roof types and just focused on the gable. And so it's 6 gables in total, not 7, that are paired, and they're starting to use steeper pitches. So if the contractor canon is like 12 over 12, I started using 14 over 12, 17, or 19 over 12. The third model that I'd like to speak about tonight is the 1-to-1 model. This is a 2-minute animation that kind of shows the construction sequence. There are 87 CLT panels. They're assembled together in 14 days with a 40-ton crane and 4 people. So what's super interesting to me is in the way that the real construction, it's trying to be serious, it's real, starts to remind us of any scaled model being assembled in our studio or our office setting. So if you squint your eyes to see this construction sequence, it reminds us of the model being assembled out of like flat laser cut foam core chipboard pieces. The 1-to-1 model is real, it's no longer a representational model, and it describes the reality of building a massing. We had 4 engineers, one of which was Hanif Kara from London at AKT, who's really been a mentor and kind of pushing me to take on something very overwhelming like cross-laminated timber. There's an engineer out of New Hampshire called Benson Wood, who was really working on the design development. And then they farmed out the calculations to a mass timber engineer called Fire Tower, who specializes in, obviously, mass timber. And then there was an engineer in Atlanta who's doing this concrete box that's then tying the CLT box to the concrete box. And then you can see on the left as all these panels get moving in, there is somebody helping me with logistics, getting 11 40-foot-long hotshot trailers from Savannah, Georgia, over to Atlanta. And the staging of that. So I think that's it. So this is at the end of day 1. I think they got 13 panels in. The product's coming from KLH in Austria, who basically made or break the kind of project in terms of construction budget. All the North American manufacturers were coming in $85,000 more expensive than having it come on 3 open-top containers to the Port of Savannah. With this kind of geometry, obviously there's a lot of connections and a lot of angles being kind of snugly fit. This is a set of drawings that the CLT installer, we had kind of we moved him through the 3D model a few times on some conference calls with like a screen share, but he actually had no 3D model on site. So he's literally putting the house together with this kind of set of construction sequence, which was all designed and prepared and agreed upon before we get to site. So it was like numbered 1 through 87. And then the smaller call-out drawings is Benson Wood working through all of the connections, both in terms of like the placement of the screws, which are between 9 and 14 inches, and their angles and precisions that have to be hit on site or they're going to come through the interior of the house. Somebody from AKT in London went over to Austria to inspect the panels before they went on the ship. And this is all a very huge risk to develop a house out of material and product that's coming from Austria. And then if something goes wrong with one of those 87 panels, like say number 45, there's a huge problem. We'd have to stop construction, right? And I don't know what we have done. There really wasn't a backup plan for that scenario. But this is the open top container. Another risk, like you're putting a lot of product that is finished product in a container for 4 to 5 weeks with like just a tarp over the top. So there's a lot of concern about moisture and whatever happens on the sea. And then everything's being craned and lifted in. These are some of the angles and some of the cuts that were manufactured. So they were everything was flip milled. And so anything kind of getting off would have a direct result in the field. Yes, it's wood. We can cut it, you know, with a skill saw in the air, which we had to do a few times. But yeah, there was a real ambition to get kind of the tolerances correct. So there were stacks and stacks of CLT arriving on a 24-foot lot just beside us. So it was kind of a logistical nightmare to get these hoisted in one by one or find, you know, the next panel, maybe potentially 3 or 4 panels down. Panel number 40. So the person leading the installation crew is right there on the roof, like in this heroic shot. I don't know how he timed that, but that's the longest panel that we installed. And Terry installed the first CLT house in the US in Seattle by an architect named Susan Jones. And so she's been really a mentor in like talking me through this process. And so I called him up and said, you've installed the first CLT house. And so you're basically the expert in the country. Will you come to Atlanta and put this together in 2 weeks' time? So he kind of dropped everything and assembled a crew, one of which had construction experience, 2 of which did not. And this is like the skyline of Atlanta just off from the neighborhood. So when working on the ordinary and starting with these basic types, you know, what got exciting was seeing the gable happen here in the middle and then looking straight above and seeing like the kind of almost alignment with the neighbor's ordinary gable. So this was not planned, but this is kind of what emerges when doing work like this. Yeah, so this is the one-to-one massing model. And just after the CLT was put together, I asked the architectural photographer to come in and shoot the kind of raw CLT. So he had like a 6-hour window before we had to try to get the thing waterproofed as soon as possible. Again, everything on the interior, this is the exterior porch, but just to the right of the slide, that's all finished product. So there's an ambition to kind of not damage it even further. And these are some of the shots. It was like perfect light, perfect 6 hours. This is one of my favorite views of the project, which is upstairs, and you see like a kind of perfect gable being hung from a non-perfect roof structure. The CLT is 3-ply for the exterior walls, 5-ply for the roof, and 7-ply for the floor. So when thinking about the wall assembly, and we're building on a very tight lot in the city of Atlanta, basically we had to take on a 1-hour fire rating. And so CLT, the city of Atlanta was working to the 2012 building code, not 2015, which CLT is accepted and written into the code. And so we're just having to also pass that hurdle, but also prove 1 hour. And so basically it just meant that we started adding a lot of layers to the exterior. Or the other option is to do a residential fire sprinkler. So the first layer is a water-resistant barrier that's breathable, and that's the orange thing. And then the next layer is like a 3-dimensional mesh. So if water does get in, we just want it to drain kind of straight out. That's the green layer. The next is a 2-inch insulation. And so with CLT, you get 1 R value per inch. So the wall's 4 inches, you get R4. And then this insulation's doing like 17, I think. The DENS glass is 5/8 of an inch, and so that's like the conceit. That's where the 1-hour fire rating comes in. The next layer is like the wire mesh before a 3-coat cementitious stucco is applied. And the stucco, the glitter stucco is like really like, I can't do any more wood. There's all this wood on the interior. And so this was like another version of the ordinary. This is like 8 weeks ago. And this is the project pretty much, let me see. Yeah, so this is just this past weekend. There's about 5 days left until it's finished. Yeah, and so I think this was the ambition, was always to try to make the image of the house very similar to those kind of white foam, EPS foam massing models that I showed earlier. I think that's about it, and I'm really on time, Matt. So thank you so much for the invitation.
Any questions for Jennifer?
So is it a cavity furnace? How did you handle plumbing, electrical, HVAC?
So in terms of HVAC, we're doing 2 things, like part traditional. So I didn't really talk about it, but the concrete box is the open carport, and it's traditionally framed. And so we're stuffing AC, and it's coming up through the house. And then at the top level, we've installed 2 ductless mini splits on 2 different ends of the house. And that piping is on the outside of the CLT, behind all those layers, behind the stucco.
What about plumbing?
Okay, so plumbing and electrical is kind of cleverly located in parts that are exterior, or we built kind of like 2 chases. One a vertical chase and one a horizontal soffit, and those things are kind of feeding up exactly where they need to go. It's only 2 bathrooms, 1 kitchen sink, so there's like very specific points where we're bringing the water up through the house.
So a lot of the electrical conduit is it exposed?
No, so the faux finishes, I'm telling us a story which is about a concept and materiality and an ambition, but the faux finishes are actually doing work, they're functional, and so all of the electrical is routed into the base of the panels, so that's running on the top floor of the CLT, which has got sleepers. So we're running electrical, and then we're just popping up super low. We place the outlets super low. And so the faux finishes is the wainscoting that's kind of hiding that. Yeah, the ambition was not to go the conduit route and to see all of the wires. Yeah, so I had been lecturing on the ordinary, getting really excited about those 2x6, all those images I showed, right? And I was like, well, I grew up like around construction sites in North Alabama, and I know that you could build any form basically, and it's very exciting. But what I had kind of forgotten that they end up being attics, or you have this cross member that's going across, right? And so I didn't want to see the cross member, and so Hanif Kara was really encouraging me to think about wood, but think about a new system and thinking about mass timber. And so to do all of these geometries, it begins to become a folded plate. But they are 2x6s, and they are glued together. And so I think, you know, it's just a new version of how to use 2x6s, right? They're highly engineered, they're glued, and they're cross-laminated.
You talk about the South a lot, and I think this project specifically is a really wonderful addition to a city that's lacking a lot of really ambitious architecture. Are you part of the Northeast now, or do you ever see yourself returning to the South at any point?
Yeah, so that was the big dilemma when I tried to work on that guidebook project with students at Georgia Tech. I'd gotten a position that was like this fancy named position. It came with money and a research in the ambition to make a research project. And I had worked professionally in London. I'd taught on the West Coast, and I'd studied on the East Coast. And I was like, oh, I'm kind of going home in a way. And so it was really time to think about kind of being annoyed with how much attention the East and West Coast get. And, you know, I was definitely like a part of it, and trying to kind of recalibrate or refocus attention just like the Dirty South rappers did in the mid-90s. But it's by design that this house is in Atlanta and not in another city. And it's by design, like the next project I'd like to also do in Atlanta. So there is some commitment to working in a place that I know, but from a distance is not by design. It just happens to be where I'm at the moment.
Great. Atlanta really needs that. Thank you.
Thanks.
I was just curious, following on from that Atlanta question about just locally, just in the design scene locally and also just in the neighborhood, what kind of reception the project has and interest and...
Yeah, when a 40-ton crane rolls in and starts like picking up 87 panels and it got a lot of, there's always like spectators kind of like looking on. But the city, I also was there when I made the Domestic Cats project, so that gallery was on the west side of Atlanta. So there was, I guess, a connection to doing the conceptual work there and then trying to then build it. But yeah, people, you know, people like to say, oh, the roof is confusing, but I keep trying, you know, the reason I'm making it is to make that link back to popular culture, the everyday things we know, but then just slightly kind of hack it and reformulate it in a way. So it is familiar, you know, obviously, but different, yeah.
All right. Thank you, Jenna.